Well, good afternoon to everybody in the room in Como, and well, maybe good evening or good morning, depending on where the online participants are calling in from. Great pleasure to be with you. I would have loved to be with you at the beautiful Lake Como. I hope you have wonderful weather there and some nice sample some nice food. Unfortunately, my agenda didn't allow, so you have to do with my virtual performance here, but I hope I can still contribute something useful and interesting to this event. I was asked by the organizers to address the question of reshoring, which obviously is a fairly important discussion point these days, or already, let's say, in the recent past, and to look at this also from the point of view of the strategic innovation agenda for the European textile industry. And I will try to do that. I will first of all very briefly introduce myself and the organization I represent. My name is Lutz Walter. I'm the Secretary General of the Textile ETP in short, which stands for the European Technology Platform for the Future of Textiles and Clothing, as Chinky already mentioned. We consider ourselves the largest community of textile research and innovation professionals in Europe. We have quite a bit of history, launched almost 20 years ago out of the European Textile Industry Association, Eurotex. We're Brussels-based, an independent non-profit organization since 2013. And well, you have the figures here on the screen. So we're interacting with more than 250 organizations on a regular basis, and these organizations can be companies, research organizations, universities, associations, clusters, technology providers, etc., all linked obviously to the textile and clothing sector from all over Europe. We connect well over 1,000 individual experts, all with the objective of working towards long-term competitiveness of this sector in Europe based on collaborative market-oriented research and innovation. We have basically three types of services that we offer. The first one is networking, so we bring people together across Europe, across the industry research divide, so to speak, across the value chain, across technology domains. We do that in events and conferences and obviously also online more and more. We have a members platform and various information services. Then the second activity that we've built quite significantly recently is our learning activities, where we run a European masterclass on innovation circular and bio-based textiles. We also run a learning community on smart or e-textiles. We also, from time to time, published what we call strategic research agendas. So this is a kind of a think tank work that we do to map sort of the future directions of research and innovation in textiles. We also, and that's our third function, we help our members to access EU funding opportunities more easily, support Eurotex in advocacy for more textile research funding, run a brokerage activity for people that want to build project partnerships, and we also, until this year, ran a small accelerator funding program for e-textiles. So that's just as a short background. We are a membership-based organization, and a fairly accessible one at that. So for a €300 annual membership, you can be part of the Textile ETP. So if you're interested in that, feel free to contact me, and my contact details are on the last slide. But now off to the actual theme of the presentation. When we talk about reshoring, well, obviously that assumes that some offshoring has taken place before, because if you haven't offshored anything, it's very difficult to reshore anything. So the starting point of a discussion on reshoring must be the situation in terms of offshoring of the European textile and clothing production. Now, when you talk about offshoring, then, well, people typically assume that, well, you offshore because you benefit from lower labor costs in countries far away from Europe. That's not the only reason why companies offshore, and that's, I think, very important to understand also when you think about the opposite, reshoring then. So companies obviously do offshore production because of labor cost differentials, especially in the area of garment making, so the more labor intensive activities, but they may also exploit lower costs in other domains such as energy, water, material costs, etc., in the more, let's say, resource intensive parts of the industry, such as dyeing and finishing. Other reasons to offshore is also easier resource access. So it's not necessarily just a question of cheaper labor, it's maybe just a question of available labor force that makes company offshore production. It may also be more privileged or easier or cheaper access to raw materials or feedstocks. For instance, if you think about a producer of man-made cellulosic fibers who may set up a factory in the tropical countries where access to forestry feedstocks is easier or cheaper. Another driver of offshoring also can be regulation. It's not often admitted and easily talked about, but it does play a role that certain of those offshoring locations may have laxer environmental health or safety regulations, which may make certain activities well, easier or even just doable. So, and I think we have examples when you look at certain natural fiber processing steps, such as wool scouring or others, where you would find it very difficult to run such an operation in Europe, for instance. So that has played a role. And of course, the last and by far not least is that also you can offshore because there is market demand over there. So if you follow your customers offshore, so if you're, for instance, a supplier of textiles to, let's say, the automotive industry, and your big automotive customer is opening a production facility in, I don't know, Mexico or China, well, then it may make sense or it may be necessary that you follow your customer and set up manufacturing over there. And of course, also, if you are an end market, a consumer end market brand, well, you may find it easier to serve your end market from local manufacturing. So you actually place manufacturing where you have end market demand. So all these are reasons to offshore. And when we look at reshoring, all these reasons should be considered, and not all of these reasons will go away just because labor cost differentials change or resource cost change. Now, it's interesting to look at what actually happened in terms of offshoring of EU textile and clothing production over the last 20 years, or 22 years I have here on my slide. And I looked at the starting year 2005, which is not incidental because this is when the agreement on textiles and clothing, the ATC, came to an end. So the quota system was completely phased out. And what you could see quite understandably is that in the years following 2005, the trade balance, actually, especially in terms of clothing, for Europe actually worsened quite significantly. What you should, if you look at this slide here, it's important to understand we're looking here at the volume trade balance in units. So that's not in values, but in volumes. That, in my opinion, reflects real production much better. And you see the sort of the dark green bars are clothing, and the lighter sort of turquoise color is textiles. And what is perhaps surprising to people, and was surprising to me when I looked at this, that actually the narrative of saying, well, we've been offshoring more and more production from Europe into the rest of the world is actually not fully true. Because if you look at the overall volumes, and if you look at the year, for instance, 2008, and compare it with 2021, there has been no volume increase in terms of garment imports into Europe, or at least in terms of the trade balance. And even for textiles, it's not been much of an upward trend. You see a bit of a seemingly upward trend in 2020, 2021, but I can tell you this is almost entirely due to made up non-woven articles, so essentially face masks and other PPE products, which were imported into Europe in quite astonishing quantities. So, but if you leave that extra effect aside, you also see that in terms of textile production, there isn't really been a massive trend over the years. So we're not looking really at a really massively increasing offshoring trend already over the last 10, 15 years. But still, of course, offshoring took place very clearly. There was already offshoring going on, obviously, before 2005. And it's important to understand what effects offshoring have, both on the company, on the individual company, but also on an entire industry, entire market. So there's some positive effects that obviously for the company, offshoring usually lowers manufacturing costs. It makes it easier or faster to access local markets, easier and cheaper to access local suppliers. But there are also negative impacts. Obviously, your supply chain becomes longer, becomes, as we know now, more vulnerable to disruption. The management of that supply chain becomes more complex. Logistic costs goes up. You have a much slower time to market, so you have to work with much longer range forecasting in your order cycles. And you also lose, obviously, locally in your company competences and capacities, especially those related to production. For the industry, is pretty much the same thing. So obviously, yes, offshoring brings lower prices to the end market. So it brings sort of also the positive effect is that there's global industrialization, market development. It can strengthen brands, globally speaking. It also allowed industries, for instance, in Europe, to focus on higher added value. But the disadvantages also you see on the overall industry cycle, that you have more supply disruptions and more complex value chains. You also see generally more overproduction because market forecasting errors are bigger if your forecast becomes longer range, which leads then to markdowns and greater amounts of waste, which we all know is a big problem in the sector. And also on an industry level, you look at loss of local production capacities and local production or industry competences. So all of that is so it's a two-sided coin where there are positives and negatives. So now, if we switch to the concept of reshoring, I think it's important to understand what reshoring really is, what it really means, so that we're talking about the same thing. So first of all, you have to understand there is, in principle, there can be absolute and relative reshoring. So absolute reshoring is really when production volumes, and I'm talking obviously from the European perspective now, when production volumes grow in Europe while import volumes decrease, or at least they rise much slower than the end market actually grows. So that means that in absolute volume terms, we are producing more in Europe and less of what we consume in Europe is getting produced outside Europe. However, if you look at, and often when we look at offshoring, reshoring, we look at trade balances, as I've done before in my slide. So, and you can have improvements in trade balance just because your imports grow slower than actually the market grows. So you get some statistical effects. Also, Brexit actually led to an improvement of trade balance of the remaining EU countries because, well, all of a sudden we had a very big export market that the EU gained, which was the UK. So our trade balance actually after Brexit looks much better than before. So, but this is simply a statistical effect. It's not something that tells you anything about production trends. There's also product price inflation effects, which have actually, they don't tell you anything about production volume. So there are things in terms of relative reshoring that are not what I would consider the real reshoring that we are interested in. And then also the other thing that we have to understand is that, well, reshoring does not necessarily mean that we bring jobs, manufacturing jobs, back to Europe in our case. So we can also grow production volumes or values, of course, without actual employment growth, thanks to automation, digitalization, and so on and so forth. So also this is something to be kept in mind when talking about reshoring. So now when we look at how it really happens practically, so obviously, and that's what most people think about when they think about reshoring, is that, well, we look at some type of manufacturing that has been previously moved away from Europe and it's brought back into the EU for serving local EU demand. So something that you have produced outside Europe for the European market, all of a sudden you move it back into production in Europe to serve the European market. But that's not the only way that reshoring happens. You also can have production volume growth in existing, or innovation and new capital investment in existing factories in Europe, instead of investment in offshore sites. So that also has, in statistics, then clearly a reshoring effect, because we produce more in Europe without actually bringing any capacities back, because the capacities that we have are simply increased. And finally, we can also create new manufacturing units in Europe by existing European companies or local startups, or even foreign companies that invest in Europe. But some of this investment may actually not serve the local market, but actually also the export market. So there are different ways of increasing, let's say, the production of textile or clothing products in Europe, which all is something that I believe we're talking about when we mean reshoring, but it's not necessarily, or when it's what we want to see, but we not necessarily think about all these things when we talk about reshoring. And then obviously also we have to distinguish between reshoring and what is the other term that is used quite often, nearshoring. And just to explain that, I think it's pretty clear to everybody, but I still wanted to make it clear. We're talking here about reshoring, really production from offshore, meaning far away locations, back to the actual region of consumption. So if we define the region of consumption as the EU, then moving production from China to Romania would be clearly reshoring. But also moving production from nearer shore locations such as Turkey to Portugal would also be considered reshoring, because you bring something from outside the consumption region back into the consumption region. And then nearshoring, obviously that means that you move something from far away back to a region that is close but not inside the consumption region. So for instance, if we move something, production from Vietnam to Tunisia, we nearshore from an EU market perspective. So we bring something closer to Europe, but not inside the EU. So that's just really to understand the terminology, which I think is important. So, but then I think the more important point is really then, once we're clear about what reshoring is, well, to look at it, what actually drives the reshoring. And here, I think I want to come back a bit, obviously, to what I explained is what drives offshoring, because then that makes you also understand what could drive reshoring in reverse. And I want to split it into four domains. One is market demand, one technology, resilience, and regulation or circularity. And I will come and I will talk briefly about each four of them. So if you start at market demand, so market demand drivers for reshoring can be several ones. Obviously, we have those drivers that relate to sustainability, and there is clearly a sustainability aspect to reshoring. If you think about product environmental footprints, footprints related to logistics, to transport, the issue that I mentioned in terms of shorter forecasting cycles, meaning less forecasting errors, meaning less markdowns, less waste. So clearly there is a sustainability dimension. So companies that want to show more or want to demonstrate more sustainability of their products may decide for that reason to produce closer to home. Then we also see certain trends from the end market side, from the consumer side, to say, well, we are more interested to buy more local because, well, either we believe more local is more sustainable, or we believe more local is better in some way on. But we have this trend, and this is a trend that we see is a reinforcing trend. It's not a massive trend, but clearly something that plays into the whole reshoring discussion. We also see some newer business models. So companies that go direct to consumer usually also want to exploit that direct relationships in terms of time to market. So they want to produce or they want to be able to deliver quite quickly to that consumer that they're in direct contact with. And they also tend to be interested in more customized or even personalized products for those consumers. And if you talk about customization, you talk about personalization, you talk about very small volumes, even single piece production, and that often is not something that you want to do really on the other side of the world, because the efficiency of scale basically is lost, and it's you add to logistic costs, and it doesn't make any sense. I think another driver also is the whole idea of the resale, reuse, and rental model, which also can be a driver for reshoring. If you think about from a quality point of view, or from the point of view that you can bring products sort of back into a kind of production or reprocessing or repair cycle, which then make it fit for another consumption cycle. So that can also be a driver for production facilities inside the EU market. And also we see public procurement possibly as a driver, not a very big one right now, but we see with the sustainability trends that public procurement could drive, especially in areas like workwear and interior textiles for public markets. That could be a driver. Now, if you jump to the technology dimension, and here I could easily talk for hours to you, but I won't do that. I will refer you simply to our latest strategic research agenda that we published in April of this year, where we describe all the major technology and innovation trends that we see for our industry. When we look at reshoring, there are a number of drivers that I believe have a clear impact on reshoring, or can have an impact. The whole aspect of digital production, so highly digital production, which is usually also somewhat linked to fast delivery, fast time to market, has also this element of saying, well, we set this digital production up closer to where the market demand is, because we then exploit this kind of digital efficiency also in terms of time to market, and that's positive. Somewhat related to this is the concept of microfactories. So especially if you talk about customized small runs, even personalized products, maybe also in the future related to this kind of repair and reconditioning cycles, which you can possibly then also do in such microfactories. And they are usually quite digitized as well, equipped with digital printing, digital single ply cutting, and all these kind of technologies that make those production processes quite efficient. Of course, robotics and automation we see still as a general trend, and we will see more advances in robotics that may bring us eventually even closer to that long-term dream of fully automated, fully robotic garment making, where we're not there yet for sure, and we will probably not be there completely within the next 10 or 15 years, but it is still something that where we see a lot of advances in technology. And also the issue of more resource efficient production, again, linked to sustainability, where we say if we have new technologies that have a more resource efficient footprint, so we have less of a need to outsource to countries where maybe those resources are cheaper. So if we need less of those resources, then we can also produce closer to home. So these are just some of the technology drivers, and there's certainly others that could also play into the reshoring trend. Then another important point, and well, there are different terminologies for that. believe Dirk van Tighem, the Director General of Eurotech, spoke to you about the EU textile strategy this morning. And one of the aspects that is being discussed in this strategy a lot is the term of resilience, or sometimes also named strategic autonomy, meaning that Europe as a region, as a political bloc, wants to be more independent, more strategically autonomous when it comes to critical supplies of all sorts of materials and end products, and textile-based products are part of that as well. So, but this is not the only driver. There's also the market drivers themselves, where we see more and more volatilities in the end market, which makes it more and more difficult to forecast. We have supply chain costs that are constantly going up, and we have supply chain vulnerabilities and disruptions that make many companies question these very long, far-ranging supply chains, very complex supply chains, which are very difficult to manage smoothly and efficiently if the external conditions are so volatile. Labor markets also play a role. So we generally had obviously the trend that labor availability was much better outside Europe than inside Europe. I'm not saying that this changes dramatically, but there is certain roles that you see certain developments in certain of the more developed markets. If you look at, for instance, coastal China, for instance, where labor costs are rising as well quite dramatically. So that may also be, so the driver saying, well, we go offshore because labor is so much cheaper, may not be the condition that will last forever. And we also see, I think, with the global geopolitics, that we may see also new trade barriers coming up rather than old trade barriers going. So the idea of just constantly growing and liberalizing global trade is something that is less and less the reality today. So in the interest of time, I'm moving forward. I'm not quite sure where I am with my time slot. So an important driver clearly is regulation. And well, I think by now everybody has heard about the EU textile strategy, so I don't think I need to introduce that in much detail. But in that strategy and in the implementation of that strategy, there's certainly elements that will be drivers, that can be drivers for reshoring. The circular economy is a very big one. So if you want to make your products and your materials circular and you recycle them, then often it will not make sense to ship those recycling products or materials offshore to then bring them back. So you have, instead of sort of a one direction logistics, you have a two-way logistics cost that you have to cover, and that may make this manufacturing far away much less economic. There is a very substantial work on eco-design that will be in one way or another mandatory for textile products in the future in Europe. And some of these eco-design rules will certainly also favor, certainly not prescribe local production, but certainly favor local production. So again, certainly also a driver. Traceability requirements, digital product passports is something that will be coming, and that will put a lot of pressure on complex supply chains to provide all the information that is needed for this digital passport. And if you have a very complex supply chain with very far away partners in it, then that makes it very difficult. So local traceability certainly is much easier than global traceability. And also due diligence, with respect to working conditions, labor rights, all these kind of things will become stricter, and that again is something that we know is more challenging to manage in a very globalized and very complex value chain. So really many factors that, in my opinion, can combine, and that I think is the very important message to take from this here. It is not just one driver that will define if production moves back or production volumes grow again in Europe. But there are several drivers that all seem to point in the same direction. That's what I believe is clearly an indication that it is actually happening. Now, obviously, you can also look at what the industry is actually doing or thinking, and I will show you here just on one slide some data that has been collected by the French Fashion Institute, IFM. That's data from December last year, where they asked clothing brands and retailers, not just French ones, but probably a significant majority French-based or French headquartered ones, about their sourcing strategy or importing strategies for the year 2022. So these were intentions, not actual realized figures, but nevertheless, I think it's quite telling. So you see on the top here, 4 of the most significant sourcing destinations for garments: China, Bangladesh, Vietnam, and India. And you see all those red shares in the pie are respondents who said that they plan to decrease actually importing or sourcing from those markets, whereas the yellowish figures are planned increase. So you see quite significant planned decreases in all those markets, especially China, quite striking. And then if you look at the reshoring and the nearshoring destinations, you see that they're much less of a planned decrease and much higher increasing plans for these kind of markets. So both the within Europe and near EU manufacturing locations, all likely to see increasing orders rather than decreasing ones. So again, it's a single year snapshot, is not necessarily an indication of an overall trend, but clearly an interesting indication. So coming to my conclusion and a bit of an outlook. So let's say the offshoring situation or trend of textiles and clothing product was something that has developed, as we have seen, over a long period of time. It's a huge industrial system which will certainly not change overnight. So anybody who believes that textile and clothing production will shift back in a massive wave from Asia to Europe certainly is deluding himself. However, I firmly believe that we are at or maybe already past peak of textile clothing offshoring from Europe. So this post-ATC adjustment, so the adjustment to the non-quota situation has long been achieved. So everybody who wanted to outsource from Europe has done that and has taken its conclusion of whether it's beneficial or not, and to what extent they make use of it in the business or not. As I said, there are many drivers that combine to make manufacturing in and near Europe more favorable again. I personally believe that regulation and the resilience argument are the strongest drivers for the time being, whereas the technology and the market demand drivers are probably still more of an emerging trend that can probably reinforce the other two rather than being the main driver. So reshoring, in my opinion, especially of garment making, is real. But we have to clearly say, when it comes to the EU, it is massively labor constrained. So we simply do not have the skilled garment workers in Europe, no matter which country you look at, that we would need to absorb a massive reshoring of garment making into the EU. So that is something that is probably the biggest constraining factor for reshoring. That's why I believe nearshoring into the so-called pan-Euromed countries is probably a very important and significant second trend, where labor shortage probably is less of an issue, although skilled labor is always an issue. But in terms of total labor force availability, also age, demographics, and so on, are much more favorable in these countries. But of course, we know that there are also downsides in terms of infrastructure challenges and also political risks. So this is something that companies will have to balance. And so in all likelihood, these countries will be part of the mix and can be for certain companies an important part of the mix, but probably not sort of single source locations for companies. And I think we will see in general much less single source, single country sourcing in the future, simply based on the recent experience that companies had that relied on one single sourcing location, which then came into some kind of geopolitical or other trouble, and then all of a sudden was not available. So of course, I have to caveat this with the very current situation of very high inflation across many cost domains, whether obviously energy, everybody has that on the forefront, but also material costs are going up, logistics costs are going up, labor costs are going up globally. So, and also obviously the geopolitical tensions that have increased quite significantly make the forecasting very uncertain. So there are many uncertain factors in it, but still I believe on the medium to long term, we will see this reshoring and nearshoring trend play out. With a number of conditions. So clearly automation, digitalization needs a further acceleration push. So I don't think the textile and clothing industry is a forerunner when it comes to automation and digitalization. So, but we're catching up. So that is something that will increasingly be felt in terms of production efficiencies. As I said, we are suffering from a major skilled labor shortage in Europe. So if we are not addressing that shortage through reskilling, upskilling efforts, then we will not be able to take advantage of that market opportunity that will come our way. Sustainability regulation and enforcement will be getting more serious, but also we have to be careful not to oversteer here. So if I call it suicidal, if the sustainability regulation becomes so onerous that companies can't literally not produce in Europe anymore, well, then it wouldn't be a positive driver, but I doubt that we will get to that point. But enforcement will get more serious. So simply moving production outside Europe to avoid regulation is something that probably will get more and more difficult. So that's probably also rather a positive driver. I think on the pan-Euromed integration, more work needs to be done because there is really a great labor pool available that Europe should really make use of, and it will be clearly a win-win for Europe and those countries. So I believe that we will again work clearly in that direction. Yes, there are potentials for short-term accidents, the energy crisis being one of those. So if this situation lasts for much longer, there could be vital parts of the industrial ecosystem that could be seriously damaged or destroyed. And as we know, if once a supply chain is not complete anymore, if significant parts of a supply chain are missing, then the whole supply chain is not viable anymore, and then we may look at very different scenarios as well. But again, we hope that this can be averted. And I think there's a big role to play by industry bodies and the policymakers to work together on a textile strategy that is smart, that is a future strategy where raw materials, chemicals, energy, skilled labor, innovation, regulation and market surveillance are all addressed together in a synergistic way rather than in a way that works against each other. It's complex, but we are on track to that, and I think we will see much more of that in the coming years. So I really believe that the reshoring trend is for real. It's not a massive wave, but is a real significant opportunity that could be and should be captured by textile and clothing producers currently active in Europe or those who may start up here. We see startup trends that we haven't seen in the last 10, 20 years, and there may also be more direct investment into the European market or near the European market by non-European companies. So all of that could also be an important driver. So with this, I would like to end my presentation. I hope you found it insightful. I don't know if we have a possibility of interaction. If there is time for questions, happy to answer them. Otherwise, you have all my credentials here. So if you want to get in contact with me afterwards, you're very welcome to do so. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lutz. Any questions for Lutz? No? We had a few questions, but you've answered them as you went along. They were all virtual attendees, but you've covered that all in your presentation. Okay. Thanks, Lutz. Thanks for your time. I know we are running.
Okay. Thank you very much.
I'm waiting for your turn. So thank you so much.
No problem. Wishing you a good conference. Bye-bye.